Thank you, Stephen. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Before we go to the formal business of this evening's meeting, I'd just like to welcome members of the Society of Promotion of Hellenic Studies. This is a joint lecture with the Society. If, I think Leslie Fitton, the Society's Honorary Secretary, is just going to step forward and say a couple of words.
And I think I need to use the microphone for the recording. The President has very kindly, thank you, allowed me to welcome you on behalf of the Hellenic Society and actually of the Roman Society too. I'm here with my colleague Fiona Hara, who is the actual secretary, as opposed to the honorary secretary, of both the Hellenic and the Roman Societies. And we just thought this was too good an opportunity to miss, to invite you warmly, if you're not a member of one or the other society, please do consider joining. This is a two-word elevator pitch. I don't need to say more. You can find all the information on both of the websites, and we have some flyers that tell you all about what the societies do and how to join, which we've left by the door. So please give it your consideration, and thank you so much. And thank you, President, for allowing me to say that.
Thank you, Leslie. The minutes.
Ordinary meeting, Thursday, the 13th of June, 2024. Burlington House and online, summer soiree. Professor Martin Millett, President in the chair. The minutes of the anniversary meeting of the 25th of April, 2024 were read and signed. The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, were duly admitted fellows. Elizabeth Gemmell, Christian Liebel, and Nicola Pickering. The following communications were then laid before the Society. The fall of the Roman Empire and the barbarian gold hemorrhage, 5th century solidus export from centre to periphery in the late Roman Empire by Dr. Svante Fischer, FSA, and Roman Mosaics of Britain, Research and Discoveries since 2010 by Dr. David Neal, FSA, and Dr. Stephen Koch, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be Thursday, October the 3rd, 2024, and then adjourned the meeting. A summer PIMS reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? I'd better sign them otherwise. Thank you. Ballots.
The following candidates for election will be put to ballots, which close 31st of October and the 28th of November. I'm reading a short version of the blue paper. The full version is available now for inspection on the Fellows platform. Alex Barker, archaeologist and director of the Arkansas Archaeological Survey. John Benjamin, jewellery historian and consultant. Paul Britton, vice chair, Cathedral Fabric Commission, Friends of Friendless Churches. Sarah Cockerell, independent medieval historian. Jane Desborough, keeper of the science collections at the Science Museum. R. Grant Gilmore, archaeologist and heritage management consultant. Matthew Hurst, curator, Woburn Abbey and Gardens. Ian Quinn, professor of organ and coordinator of sacred music, Florida State University. Andrew Rabin, professor of English, University of Louisville. Christine Rose Beers, head of conservation and heritage at Cambridge University Library. Catherine Taylor, manager Director of Tivas Island, a project manager and field archaeologist. Mark Webb, medieval archaeologist. Jamie Wood, Professor of History and Education, University of Lincoln. Jane Evans, archaeologist and recognised pottery specialist. Matthew Haley, auctioneer, head of books and managing director of Bonhams in Knightsbridge. Leslie Hardy, priest and honorary research fellow, Canterbury Christ Church University. Bruce Janacek, Professor of History, North Central College, USA, and a leading authority on the Renaissance alchemy. I can't say the word.
Alchemy.
Alchemy tradition. Apologies. Ben Jennings, archaeologist with expertise in wetland settlement, particularly in the later prehistory of the Alpine region, and Colin Michael Welsh, archaeologist with expertise in the history and archaeology of the V weapon offensive of 1944 to 45.
Thank you very much, Shahina. We specialise in a few tongue twisters just to make things more interesting for people. Admissions.
The following, being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, desire to be admitted a fellow. Nicholas Milner, Natasha McEnroe. Nicholas Milner.
Nicholas Milner, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Welcome and congratulations. Thank you.
Natasha McEnroe.
Natasha McEnroe, by the authority and in the name of the Society of Antiquaries of London, I admit you a fellow thereof. Congratulations. Welcome. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our fellow Dr. Elizabeth K. Fowden. Elizabeth, who's a colleague of mine from Cambridge, is a cultural historian interested in places where Hellenism and Islam meet. Her forthcoming book, The Parthenon Mosque, explores the Ottoman engagement with ancient Greek culture. At Cambridge, she's been supported and a member of the Faculty of Classics and the Prince Alwid bin Tahal Centre for Islamic Studies. The bridging of Greece and the Middle East at Cambridge has taken various forms. She's been a senior researcher on Andrew Wallace Hadrill's ERC project, The Impact of the Ancient City. Nice to see you here, Andrew. And has also worked on an interdisciplinary project, Greece between Europe and Asia, regionality, religion and culture, with the centre that has been involved in exhibition, symposium, Jerusalem in Exile, and another symposium on Eastern Mediterranean embroideries. I don't mess that up. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her this evening to present a paper, the Evliyan Marbles, Ottoman Views of Athenian Antiquities. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Martin. And it's a real pleasure to watch the alchemy, to have this lovely audience in this beautiful space. And for me, particularly, this space the antiquaries, because in a sense, when I first started working on the Parthenon mosque, but in general, the antiquities of Athens, I thought maybe we could talk about Ottoman antiquaries. And so in a way, this is, that's fine. Right. I just hope that what I wanted to say that I think this evening, I'm going to suggest some of the new questions that antiquaries today can ask of the material that many people pictured or whose books are in this library, questions they couldn't ask then, but I think that we can ask the material now. So, and I begin with this rather extraordinary, very barely known picture of Athens. You'll please note the minaret on the Parthenon on the top of the Acropolis, rarely pictured. I do want to just start also by thanking not just Martin, but also all of my Ottomanist colleagues that have helped me with my endless questions about Ottoman vocabulary above all things. So let's begin. European drawings of Athenian antiquities regularly included Ottoman figures as staffage, designed to show local dress and habits, but also to authenticate the traveler's own presence in situ. Situating antiquities in their actual state, as they called it, was an initiative espoused by James Stewart and Nicholas Revet as a preface to their measured architectural drawings of Athens. Here in Stewart and Revet's Antiquities of Athens, Volume 2, we see James Stewart in the act of drawing the Erechtheion while ostensibly dressed in local garb. Each actual view was accompanied by a short written description. In this case, Stewart mentions the garrison chief and his granddaughter playing with a fattened lamb. The descriptions also provided Stewart with the opportunity to comment upon local ignorance about and abuse of the antiquities in their midst. The most stereotypical Ottoman figure was the indolent, corrupt official, testament to the, quote, ignorance and jealousy of that uncultivated people, according to Stewart, in his preface to Volume 1. In an extensive footnote to the same preface, Stewart and Revet published their pre-departure proposals, explaining that the purpose of their visit was to make, quote, exact copies of the most perfect models of what is excellent in sculpture and architecture, stating, they said, the reason indeed why those antiquities have hitherto been thus neglected is obvious. Greece has been in the possession of barbarians, the professed enemies to the arts. An unusual illustration of said barbarity can be seen in another actual view that accompanies the measure drawings of the Erechtheion. In contrast with the first plate that Stewart in his red caftan and moustache, this plate is much more rarely illustrated, though to my eye, it is one of the most informative actual views produced by European travelers. This view does not, however, match Stewart's accompanying description, which mentions two pious Turks with prayer beads. The reason for the disjunction is that by the time Volume 2 appeared in 1789, Stewart had died, and his original gouache, from which the engraving would have been made, had been lost. To fill the gap, this drawing was produced by William Pars, who visited Athens in 1764 with Nicholas Revet and Richard Chandler for the Society of Dilettanti, part of whose library is in the room where you had your tea. Here we have the published engraving. What is most fascinating about this substituted view, dating just over a decade after Stewart had visited Athens, is its rare portrayal of ancient materials at the imagined moment of their reuse in the living urban fabric.
Today, we might even note that by reusing ancient fabrics left over from the multiple bombardments, the Turkish inhabitants were in fact preserving them for future discovery by archaeologists. But in the introduction to Volume 2, Stewart notes that the Acropolis walls have, quote, at different times been rudely repaired, or rather rebuilt, very little of the ancient masonry remaining. Numerous fragments of columns, cornices, and sculptures appear in several parts of them, and which make an uncouth and ruinous appearance. Plate 1 is a very good illustration. This. Now, the pictured act of reworking an ancient architectural element with a Greek inscription into a Muslim funerary headstone with an Ottoman inscription is indeed an example of a widely attested type of reuse. Here is another example from also of an Ottoman inscription carved, in this case, reused. This is an epistyle from the Erechtheion, reused in this case to record the restoration of the citadel after the explosion in the bombardment in 1687. To discover what locals thought about Athenian antiquities was not, however, clearly part of part of the European traveler's mission. Instead, the inheritance of classical authors provided a much-needed lens for interpreting the often confusing situation encountered on the ground. Stewart relied heavily on texts. Sometimes he trusted them even more than he did his own measurements. And while Stewart's philological approach to antiquities, which did include reports by more recent European viewers, such as Jacob Spon and George Wheeler, local legend, whether Greek or Turkish, was deemed, quote, too absurd to deserve a serious refutation. So my own research, coming from an interest in encounters between Greek and Islamic cultures, has been driven from the start by the desire to discover what Ottomans, whether travelers or residents, say about the antiquities of Athens. To what information and to which imaginative discourses did Ottoman viewers resort in order to make sense of what they saw? I'm especially interested in how in the early Ottoman tradition, the monuments of Athens were peopled with Greek wise men as well as Quranic prophets. Already for a millennium, scholars of Zoroastrian, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim allegiance who thought and wrote Syriac, Arabic, Persian, or Ottoman, already they had been engaging with Aristotle and Plato. The ancient sages had been accorded citizens' rights in the Islamicate world as wise men free of pagan taint. Not surprisingly, in the Muslim world, Athens was widely known as the city of sages. The city, though, was not frozen in a vague pre-Islamic past, but lived on among Muslim viewers as the stage on which prophetic legend, philosophical biography, and ancient architecture met. These figures cut across historical time in sometimes surprising ways, as when philosophers of Athens and Golden Age Baghdad were said to have conversed in the caves below the Athenian Acropolis. The Tower of the Winds was locally known as Plato's or Socrates' tent, and Plato's marble throne, where he used to teach, was shown in the Citadel Mosque. So we have underestimated the many layers of myth-historical interpretation of Athenian antiquities that prevailed before 18th century European visitors, Pausanias in hand, imposed their classical identifications. Faced with this variety, we must ask, can it really be that the Ottoman viewers were simply ignorant or oblivious as represented by our European viewers? So to start to answer this question, we need to step back before the 1750s, when Stewart and Revett first visited Athens. And when we do this, we discover that there were, in fact, Ottoman responses to figural decoration, for example, that break the usual assumption of Islamic iconophobia, iconoclasm, and general insensitivity to art that features so prominently in our discussions of Islamic views of Greek culture, but especially in our discussions of the Parthenon marbles. But before we get to the marbles, let us start with a quick historical overview of Ottoman Athens, focused especially on the Parthenon. To orient us, here is one of the few depictions of the more or less intact temple, church, mosque, as it was just before or in the act of its ruination. Now, in 1455, Athens became part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1458, only a few years after Mehmed the Conqueror's conversion of Hagia Sophia to a mosque in Constantinople, the Sultan visited the newly converted city of Athens and converted the newly conquered city of Athens and converted the Parthenon cathedral to a sultanic mosque. The largely intact 5th century BC temple had already suffered in late antiquity from fire and had later been reoriented with an apse at the east end in order to serve Christian worship, which it did for nearly a millennium. During the nearly 400 years of Ottoman rule in Athens, the Parthenon was known simply as the Citadel Mosque. From the time of Mehmed the Conqueror, in his visit in 1458, Janissary guards were quartered on the Acropolis, and as the city's Muslim population grew, the city center below also acquired Muslim inhabitants. By the mid-17th century, when our first Ottoman writer visited, the city's inhabitants had enjoyed roughly 200 years of considerable economic prosperity, and the surviving tax records show that the Muslims had grown to an estimated 1/3 of the otherwise Christian population. But by the early 17th century, piracy, climate change, and increased taxation to support the ongoing Ottoman-Venetian War over Crete had begun to trigger economic decline. The urban environment of Athens, under Ottoman rule, saw not only the adaptation of old buildings, but also the construction of new in order to serve evolving economic, social, and religious needs. There were 3 hammams, 2 tekkes, 2 khans for travelers, and 4 Friday mosques, including the Citadel Mosque. The Parthenon functioned for just over 200 years as a mosque before the bombardment in 1687. This unique city portrait on canvas can serve as a reminder of the Athens encountered by a handful of visitors who described the Parthenon in the 1660s and 1670s. One of the most detailed descriptions comes from our first Ottoman viewer, Evliya Çelebi, followed a decade or so later by the French ambassador, the Marquis de Noailles, and the travelers Jacob Spon, George Wheeler, and Francis Vernon. I will not discuss tonight these much better known European visitors. Instead, let's start now with our first Ottoman describer of Athenian antiquities, the Istanbul-born Quran reciter, envoy, and boon companion of high officials, Evliya Çelebi, who traveled across the Ottoman Empire and beyond, composing a 10-volume travel account along the way. Evliya Çelebi makes sense of the impressive buildings that he encounters with 2 strategies: comparison and Islamization. That is, he fits Athens, and above all the Parthenon, into the framework of wonders that he encountered during his 40 years of travel, and he inserts Greek antiquities into Islamic history. Evliya Çelebi visited Athens in 1667, describing it as lofty in construction, mighty in population, full of marvels and wonders and artful things. He homes in on the effect of these fine arts and wonders on those who see them. Visitors are amazed, he says, at the city's decorated artworks carved out of white marble. So the Evliyan Marbles of my title are not only the marble sculptures of the Parthenon we focus on today, but also the material itself found across the city, In the Ottoman world, marble was highly coveted, not only for its historical associations, but especially for its color and for the talismanic qualities of certain marbles, in particular the reddish jaspers and porphyry. From the time of Mehmed the Conqueror onwards, ancient and medieval marbles, both monoliths and carved elements, were systematically relocated and reused in architecture commissioned by the sultans. Evliya reports that marbles from Athens had been reused in the construction of Hagia Sophia. Now, whether or not this was true, he taps into the right spirit, since we know that rulers before the Ottomans, Justinian for one, did indeed gather in marble from across their realm precisely to manifest in the most tangible way their own wealth, authority, and appropriation of the past. In the Parthenon, Evliya's eye is drawn to the red and green marbles, fragments of which were indeed discovered in modern clearing of the site. He says 4 of the columns between the mihrab and the mimber, the pulpit, were lofty columns of red porphyry, marvels of God's creation, so shiny that they reflect one's face, each one worth the revenue of an entire clime. Next to our mimber, the 4 are 4 emerald-like columns. So his admiration conflicts a bit with the gleaming white temple in our own mind's eye, but provides us with a critical reminder that what Evliya encountered appeared to him like a church, lightly refitted for use as a mosque, not unlike Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, a building that he knew well. He recited the Quran there. What he confronted was a functioning Islamized and Ottomanized space. In fact, and this is important to stress, there is no explicit evidence that Evliya even knew that the Parthenon had been a pagan temple. Thanks to archaeological and literary research, we know that the temple's east end had been provided with an apse and ecclesiastical furniture to accommodate Christian liturgy inside the temple. The green and red marbles were still visible in the mosque and had belonged to what remained of the icon screen and the kivorium, the sort of canopy over the main altar. But Evliya's periodization habits work very differently for ours. What was pre-Islamic could remain unspecified, and ancient could include both Christian and pagan. He knows ancient sages lived in Athens, but he felt no need to specify any further. Pagans and Christians were all infidels, and in fact, several times he uses the generic word infidel, kafir, to refer to Athenians of the past. So Evliya doesn't discriminate too precisely with his architectural terms either. When he wants to refer to the pre-Islamic phase of the Citadel Mosque, he sometimes uses the neutral word ma'bed, best translated as sanctuary or shrine, or even temenos, rather than the more heavily weighted temple. In other parts of his 10-volume travelogue, he refers to the Citadel Mosque with other names, including Plato's School, or even the Church of Divine Plato, when suggestively comparing it with the ornately painted Bukovina monasteries in Romania. Wonder seems to have encouraged Evliya's associative powers when faced with great art and architecture. So, bearing in mind these observations about Evliya's historical framing, let us return to his description. While the Parthenon's colorful marble columns catch Evliya's eye, so does the apse mosaic. The mosaic had been mentioned by the traveler Rudolf Lubenow over a century earlier in 1588, but Lubenow's information was only second-hand. Evliya's is the first eyewitness account of the mosaic, whose variegated beads and small precious stones, white, black, red, and other colors, dazzling to behold, recall the mosaics of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So here we see Evliya's highly original comparative thinking at work. when he connects the colorful mosaic in the Athenian apse with the mosque apse with celebrated 7th century mosaics that adorn the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Evliya describes both Athens and Jerusalem mosques as light-filled, as adorned with elephant-sized slabs of marble, and as renowned as constructions of King Solomon. But note that Evliya does not mention that in Athens, the small stones make up an image of the Virgin and Child, as noted in our Western sources. Evliya's attention to materials and authorities is typically joined with his sensitivity to the experiential impact, as in his opening statement about the marble wonders that abound in Athens. He says, the visitor's eyes are dazzled, a word he uses a lot, dazzled at the city's marvelous depictions and images in the Frankish manner. The figures in the depictions seem to be alive, and the images smile or frown or look askance. Evliya is referring generally to artworks found across the city, and indeed he describes in detail the marble figures carved around the Tower of the Winds. But the most detailed description he lavishes on the Parthenon mosque, where in addition to colorful marbles and mosaic, Evliya would also have found figural relief sculpture and wall painting. It's striking how he avoids using the disparaging language of idols and cult statues that we find in liberal use when he describes active Christian holy sites. Instead, for Ottoman Athens and the fully Islamized Parthenon in particular, Evliya draws on a neutral, non-moralizing vocabulary of art and visual representation. Speaking of the Citadel Mosque, he writes, above the columns, which are sheltered by eaves, and above the walls are a remarkable and varied assembly of voluminous images made of white marble. One with the intellect of Aristotle would be dumbfounded at the sight of these handcrafted images and proclaim them a miracle, because to the discerning eye they appear to be alive. Now, Evliya's mention of the position under the eaves seems to secure an identification with the marble frieze. In contrast, nothing in his description points toward a particular focus on the metapiece or the pediments. It is the crowded frieze that captures his imagination. In fact, Evliya's odd admiration of the marble frieze stays with him as he travels across the world. On several occasions, it reappears as a sort of gold standard for intricate marble carving and is sometimes likened to embroidery. Let me give you a quick example from ancient Ephesus. In 1671, 5 years after seeing Athens, Evliya finds himself in front of the monumental gate of Ayasoluk, a medieval settlement that grew up adjacent to the ancient city of Ephesus. The gate marked the entrance to the major pilgrimage site of St. John the Theologian. The top register, as you see here, of the late 8th century gate's facade was adorned with reused relief carving from an ancient marble sarcophagus. Evliya records that there is an ancient gate crafted in a wondrous and marvelous manner. Above the arches are depictions in an imaginative style, like those of Behzad. Behzad is a very famous Persian miniature painter from the century before. And this style dazzles the eye and puzzles the mind, filling the beholder with admiration. Only in the citadel of Athens does one find similarly wondrous representations. As chaplain of the Levant Company in Constantinople, John Koval visited Ayasoluk in 1673, 2 years after Evliya, and was less impressed, calling the reused reliefs a patched piece of work. But scholars today identify in these scenes from the Trojan War and date the work to the 3rd century AD. But for our purposes, what is striking is Evliya's eye for similarities between animated scenes carved in white marble in ancient structures still in use at Ayasoluk and Athens. carved marble at Byblos, too, evoked another comparison by Evliya with Athens. Unlike these two brief evocations of carved wonders at Ayasoluka Byblos, the citadel mosque of Athens provokes Evliya to try harder to describe what he calls the living creatures the Lord Creator has created, from Adam to the resurrection, depicted in these marble images in the citadel mosque around the courtyard of the mosque. He then lists these creatures, of which I give you a very abbreviated version. There were fearful and ugly demons, jinns, elephants, rhinoceri, giraffes, horned vipers, snakes, centipedes, scorpions, those in the fires of hell depicted in marble, grieving and mourning and tormented by serpents and demons, and those in the gardens of paradise depicted enjoying the pleasures of the houris. Now, nothing in this description reminds us of the Parthenon frieze as we know it today. What seems likely is that Evliya's memory has been so dazzled by the teeming hundreds of figures in marble and the painting on the Parthenon's walls that he's blended them together in his retelling. Paintings were done directly onto the marble, probably in the 12th century, and covered much of the surface of the temple. Some even suggest possibly the outside, the exterior as well. Possibly the reference to the Bukovina monasteries would suggest that. Now lost watercolors, possibly one day to be found, made in 1885 and published in the Society of Antiquaries journal, Archaeologia, show rows of saintly figures that Evliya would have seen. It would seem that Evliya was especially captivated by the Last Judgment that was painted in the exonarthex at the East End, and his Islamizing eye finds houris in the classic Christian scene of torment and reward. This flowing together of painting and sculpture in the Parthenon reminds us again that Evliya does not share our preference for separating out historical layers from architectural accumulations. For Evliya, the Parthenon was remarkable for its materials and technique, but it was not enough simply to describe the extraordinary technical achievement. It was the building in use that attests the architect's skill. Evliya observes that the strange thing is that even a master architect cannot detect the places where the shiny marble slabs are joined. It is as though the entire wall were a single slab, and the wall is so shiny that the slightest speck of dust is visible. In particular, the faces and kneelings and prostrations of the worshippers are reflected in the surrounding walls as though in a mirror. So what counts most to Evliya Çelebi is the experience of architectural encounter and the stories handed down about the great authorities from the past who animate great architecture. Evliya had no access to ancient Greek or Latin texts about the buildings that he encountered in the city of sages, but he employs a mode of writing that allows him to pick up and elaborate on what he hears and sees, casually joining philosophers and monotheist prophets in the myths and legends that enlivened his rendition of the city. The cultural framing he adopts is formulaic. He includes the citadel mosque among the great ancient buildings said to have been damaged at the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. Evliya notes that this is why the building has no dome, as he expected it should have had. Evliya also notes sign of fire damage. But the building Evliya encountered was remarkably intact. This stands in marked contrast with the experience of our second Ottoman viewer, the local jurist Mahmud Efendi. And this is what he would have seen. So Mahmud Efendi would have been a boy when Evliya visited Athens, but there's no indication that they were aware of each other. It is a little known fact that this Muslim native of that this native Muslim cleric is in fact the first Athenian to write a history of the city, predating the much better known Ioannis Venizelos by nearly a century. Mahmud mentions some of the same local associations we learned from Evliya, the Olympion as the throne of the Queen of Sheba, the Tower of the Winds as a philosopher's tent. But their reasons for writing are different. Evliya aims to entertain, to inform, and to draw links between the marvelous structures inherited by the Ottoman Empire. Mahmud's sources and his methods and his aims focus exclusively on Athens, and they're much more complex. He thinks comparatively, but also synthetically, as he explains the buildings and their histories to a very elite, highly educated Ottoman audience. A native of Athens, who returned as the city's mufti after studying in Istanbul, Mahmud Efendi wrote a history of the city from its mythical origins to his own day, calling it the history of the city of sages. He states clearly in the introduction that one of his motivations in writing the city's history in the Ottoman language, and a very complex Ottoman, was to explain the wondrous ancient buildings and their beneficial stories, something he says that no one from the learned Muslim circles had done before. For Mahmud Efendi, buildings from the past had a didactic value. They spoke lessons in the present. They were records of past achievements that were not ossified but active, and the viewer's role was to interpret the messages they carried. To do this, the interpreter called on a wide range of sources, as wide as he could lay his hands on, not only autopsy and measurement, but also orally transmitted legend and written accounts. So Mahmud Efendi, like Stuart and Refit, drew on writings in ancient Greek and Latin, as well as modern, what he calls Frankish languages, all conveyed to him in collaboration with two local Christian clerics. Another difference between Evliya and Mahmud is, of course, the state of the Citadel Mosque at the time of writing, since the intact Parthenon Evliya visited and Mahmud knew about from ancient Greek and Latin writers had been gutted in 1687. Evliya saw an active mosque that had taken over the building's use as a church some 230 years earlier, its sculptures and paintings more or less intact. Mahmud saw a gaping ruin, with fragments of sculpture on the ground or still attached to a battered structure. Now, this drawing by William Pass from his visit in 1764 prefaces Stuart and Refit's measured drawings of the Parthenon and is, in fact, our earliest actual view of the second mosque. The new prayer hall was built, let me see, there you can see once the painting has become as it's printed in the Antiquities of Athens. So the new prayer hall was built of rubble from the temple and oriented on Mecca, even as it was overshadowed by the still impressive ruins. This second Parthenon mosque was not mentioned by Mahmud Efendi. His interest was the first citadel mosque that had been converted by Mehmed the Conqueror, the building that was identical with the entire intact temple and church. But at the same time, Mahmud's approach is transhistorical, compressing and extending time as he intersperses his descriptions of ancient buildings with his own eyewitness observations. For instance, like Evliya and many European visitors, Mahmud comments on the lack of mortar in the Parthenon's construction and mentions that you couldn't, even if you took a hammer to it, you couldn't separate, you couldn't put anything in between. And we have lots of accounts of European travelers too, trying to sort of hack bits away. But what's striking is Mahmud's in his method is the integration of autopsy with philology and his elision of ancient and modern conditions in order to explain the building's history and function in Ottoman terms. To illustrate this, I want to focus on Mahmud's presentation of the temple's cult statue and frieze. And this is very exciting original research on my part, and I'm very interested to hear your views afterwards. Mahmud's approach allows him to draw some striking parallels and reach some surprising conjectures, one of which even anticipates a celebrated identification made by Stuart on the Parthenon frieze. While we lack ancient descriptions of the sculptural metapiece and frieze, Phidias' statue of Athena Parthenos was mentioned by many ancient writers in Greek and Latin, including Thucydides, Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, Pliny, Pausanias, all authors that Mahmud claims to have used. Mahmud Efendi describes the famous statue inside the temple, and like ancient writers, he, as well as Phidias' contemporaries, he is especially impressed by the amount of pure gold that went into the statue's creation. Of course, the original statue had disappeared long ago, but Mahmud uses the statue as the focal point for describing the rituals and social interactions that took place on the Acropolis, read and elaborated through his Ottomanizing lens. Since the temple is in ruins, for his description of the original interior, Mahmud is dependent on written sources and possibly on any oral traditions he might have encountered from learned informants. And yet, he seems also to weave in elements still visible in the standing walls, pavements, and surrounding rubble. It is in Mahmud Efendi's description of the statue and its social context that we find one of his most ingenious remodeling of the past for his contemporary audience. Now, idols appear in Ottoman literary and visual culture primarily as marvels and curiosities, a way of understanding the pre-Islamic past inherited from the Arabic and Persian cosmographic traditions. Mahmud Efendi regularly employs this tradition to situate Athens as a repository of wonders. Like Evliya Çelebi, before you heard the use of marvelous repeatedly. Now, Mahmud does not condemn Athens for idolatry. Instead, he adopts an oblique approach, concentrating on the statue's role in charitable institutions, he explains, and their communal rituals. He does not mention the goddess's name, Athena, but refers to a figure of a young woman. He mentions that she stood in a decorated niche, which he identifies as the mihrab at the temple's east end, a feature Mahmud Efendi would have inferred from the Ottoman expectation that a niche frames a holy space or object, and perhaps even from material evidence of the apse among the ruins. He explains, inside the shrine, to the east, is a mihrab, embellished with rare, wonderful designs. Its edge is worked in a manner pleasing and attractive with relief decoration of pure gold and with many wondrous designs. Now, he goes on to describe the statue adorned with pearls and jewels, its eyes made of fiery stone with a black gem pupil. She wore a sumptuous robe worked with pure silver thread and sat on a golden bejeweled throne. It surpassed all statues from the time of Adam. And in front of the statue, he says, they drew a slender curtain of pure silver thread, worked in variegated, wondrous designs. Now, Mahmud Efendi's statue is very different from what is expected by anyone familiar with the 2nd century traveler Pausanias' brief description, for instance, in which he mentions Athena's helmet, shield, aegis, sandals. All those surfaces are adorned with relief sculpture. That what mattered to Mahmud was that the statue was honored by a niche and a curtain and appeared to be alive. Not only did its eyes sparkle, but its face was flesh-colored, a delightful detail, which would indeed have been the case for many Greek statues, which were painted with color. Statues, idols, talismans were frequently colorful or golden when illustrated in Islamic cosmographic texts or in depictions of Muhammad smashing the idols of the pre-Islamic Kaaba at Mecca. So Mahmud Efendi would have expected his Ottoman audience to have been familiar with these depictions of lifelike ancient statues. He comments that anyone who saw the statue likened it to a living being. Now, Mahmud Efendi's description continues with more signs of his acquaintance with and development of ancient sources, not only descriptions of Athena Parthenos, but also of the cloth, known in the ancient sources as the peplos, that was woven by Athenian maidens on the Acropolis in honor of the goddess. Since the early modern period, at least, scholars have not been able to agree about whether the annual peplos for the statue and the peplos made for the 4-yearly procession of the great Athena were one and the same. But Mahmud is decisive, and he reports that a curtain of pure silver thread was made every year by the Athenian maidens and hung in front of the statue. Now, his associative thinking drew in contemporary Muslim practice, as we see in the following passage, in which we have him reading the ancient texts, but interpreting them through contemporary Muslim practice. And in this following passage, he explains that every year 100 girls of marriageable age who did not have a dowry were, quote, taken into the shrine and put to work embroidering with silver thread the curtain which screened off the idol, the statue, put. This work would take each group of 100 girls exactly a year. And at the beginning of each year, the new curtain would be put in place in front of the statue. Now, Mahmud's audience would have been familiar with this practice by which curtains richly embroidered with silver thread were donated to holy sites such as saints and sultans' tombs, but above all to Mecca and Medina. Every year, the embroidered and richly woven silk textiles were replaced by new gifts. In the Ottoman period, many were later sent to the treasury at Topkapi or other great shrines. And here I've chosen 2 examples of the sort of lavish textiles that Mahmud has in his mind as he's reading the ancient sources and the evidence on the ground. Now, either through invention or confusion, Mahmud Efendi has merged 2 groups of girls known from the ancient sources, above all from Pausanias, in order to create an Ottomanizing interpretation in which he explains the rituals as part of a charitable scheme in which, devised by Pericles, he says, to assist young girls without dowries. Now, the detail about dividing the curtain between girls is curious and would not appear to derive from any otherwise known Athenian tradition, as is also the case with the following detail. The old curtain was divided into 100 pieces, which were distributed among the girls at work on the new curtain as a service to the goddess. Each girl would place on her head the fragment of the curtain hiding the goddess's statue, which had been in her possession. She would then make every sort of reverence to the goddess, and wearing a melancholy, lachrymose air and actually weeping tears, would come backwards out of the temple door. So, how might we explain Mahmud Efendi's curious details in his interpretation of ancient Athenian buildings and their rituals for his Ottoman readers? So, given that his goal in writing the history is to make sense of the ancient buildings amidst which the Ottoman population lived, wouldn't we expect that, as he does in the case of other striking buildings such as the Olympion in Athens and the Tower of the Winds, Mahmud Efendi would make some attempt to weave eyewitness observation together with his transmitted ancient texts? So what you see here is the central scene in the frieze of the temple's east end. The section had been carefully lowered to the ground from position during the construction of the eastern apse when the temple was converted into a church. It had been seen on the ground and part of it sketched by Syriac Ancona when he visited in 1436, and the relief was still more or less intact with some abrasion on the faces in the early 18th century, as it is today in the British Museum. On the right side, an adult figure stands in the center and appears to help fold up a large textile together with a smaller figure, a child or young adult, to judge by the size. To the left of the central figure stands another adult figure, facing in the opposite direction towards two more young adults, draped figures who carry something on their heads. It's not difficult to see how these two figures could have been interpreted by Mahmud Efendi as moving backwards in relation to the central figure whom they face. And might not the particular detail of the two girls placing a piece of the curtain on their heads and walking backwards in a well-known gesture of reverence be the product of Mahmud Efendi's synthetic reading of ancient accounts, together with what he saw with his own eyes on this sculpture preserved and visible on the citadel in his day. It is a great stroke of luck that a drawing by the artist traveler Thomas Hope was rediscovered in the Bernanke Museum in Athens in the late 1970s. And it shows the lowered relief, as Hope saw it, on the Acropolis later in the 18th century. Stewart and Revett saw it there too, though they did not specify where they encountered it. And it is Stewart who is today universally credited as the first person to identify this as the so-called peplos scene. So if, and we can only conjecture, what we have in Mahmud Efendi's retelling is a local mufti puzzling out what he can see in situ and trying to match it up with the textual information that has been transmitted to him in order to recreate a narrative that makes sense to his contemporary Ottoman readership. What we have is more than a curious synthesis. We have an identification of the peplos scene in the Parthenon frieze several decades before Stewart, who studied the building in 1751 and raised the possibility in the much-delayed publication of 1787. Mahmud Efendi's 10-page description of the great temple on the Acropolis is a showcase of the interpretive modes that he used in order to integrate the building and its function into an Ottoman understanding of architecture, society, and sanctity. What he had to work with is a ruinous building and a variety of ancient and modern accounts, texts. His goal was always in sight, to learn from the past in the present, to make the past alive and relevant. Elsewhere in his Parthenon account, Mahmud infuses Pericles with Solomonic authority and envisions Pericles' temple as a great pilgrimage destination on par with Jerusalem. Mahmud imagines the chryselephantine statue through the visual expectations of Muslim depictions of ancient idols and conveys the sanctity of this great temple by obliquely comparing it not only with Jerusalem, but also with Mecca and Medina, by incorporating into his narrative, his narration of the peplos ritual, the annual weaving and dividing up of the holy textile, the kiswa, a gesture his readers would naturally assimilate to the annual cutting up of the curtains dedicated at the holiest Muslim shrines, including and especially the kiswa at Mecca. So to conclude, how Europeans discovered Greece and claimed ancient Athenian values as their own has been the focus of much stimulating research, as well as much hackneyed political comment. What we've been missing are the other heirs to the Greek classical past and its long evolution, until the point when the post-classical lives of buildings began to be purged, with little record either of their material evidence or their accumulated legends and histories. As we've seen, different reasons motivated even the two Ottoman descriptions of the antiquities of Athens we've considered here. It's the associative and vibrant didactic power wielded by these viewers of Greek culture that I've attempted to bring back to light this evening as a suggestion of what approaches that fellows of the Society of Antiquaries of London might adopt today. My hope is that by taking seriously the different interpretive methods by which these surviving Ottoman viewers describe ancient art and architecture, that we can recognize some heretofore unappreciated, unrecognized intellectual and curious and cultural heirs to the antiquities of Athens. Thanks very much.
Wonderful, interesting ideas. It seems delightful. My throat mic is that on again? Yeah. We've seen some wonderful images as well as some fantastic ideas. I'm going to take sort of chair's privilege by sort of posing the first question, if I may. If you stand back from these sort of Ottoman accounts, to where does Athens sit in the Ottoman view of the world? Is it marginal and a little place, or is it, as with the Western tradition, somewhere that is placed right at the center?
I suppose one of the most surprising thing in working on this project for quite a while now is how much there is to discover, because no one has really, very, very few people, I'm not the first, but very few people have actually been asking the question of what was the Ottoman view of Athens, because generally speaking, people say it was a backwater, it wasn't important. A lot of it's in part, our questions are colored by the way in which the Europeans wanted to depict Athens as a ruin, so that they could, in fact, be the heirs and take a lot of the glory, whether it's to Bavaria or to England. And so it's by discovering and reinterpreting, sometimes for the first time, there are only maybe 2 other people have worked on these texts, you can see that there is a real fascination with Athenian antiquities, because Athens was known as the Madinat al-Hukama. I mean, it was the city of sages. And it's exactly because the Greek philosophers were so fundamental. They were translated from the Arabic, Syriac, Persian, as we said. That is the very important bridge, which wasn't just a textual bridge. By getting into these sources, we can begin to see how actually it was a visual bridge as well. And now there are some very exciting work done by Ottoman architectural historians in the ways in which, in fact, Greek architecture was played with by Ottoman architects as well. So this would be, a marvelous subject for future research, is actually comparing what Revit and their heirs were doing with what Ottomans were doing. So the answer is, I think it was much more important. We will find more and more important. I mean, there's another new text I didn't even talk about today, just edited. The new material is coming out. I apologize to Andrew, because I have been working on this project for a long time, but it's because new material is out there. So watch the space.
Questions from the floor?
Hello, thanks for a wonderful talk. It's a totally new angle on the Acropolis that I've not come across before. But a question came in my head, and maybe you can help me answer it. It's controversial, but what happened to Islam from the time that this gentleman was actually admiring the marbles to 2015, when Daesh was happy to destroy classical antiquities? What happened to their attitude in Islam to classical remains? Do you have any idea about that?
Well, I mean, I think that the beginning of a discussion about this is that there has always been a great variety. whether it's in the Islamic tradition or the Christian tradition, or even in the polytheist tradition, of how images are viewed. And there's been iconophobia, iconoclasm in all these traditions. And so even at the same time when Daesh is destroying, for very particular political reasons, Greek antiquity or Arab, also Greco-Arab antiquities, there are others who are not viewing them. They aren't in support of that at all. I mean, think of Assad, who was hanged. So one of the reasons, so the first point is that there's always going to be a variety of views, and we hear about the big ones. Actually, Brian Ward Perkins points out that we always focus on the destruction of images on the Parthenon, but the really remarkable thing, and whether it's the Christians who destroyed it or the Muslims, the remarkable thing is how much survives. You know, we tend to look at the destruction. But the reason, though, because I'm very interested in this question you pose, the reason why I've been looking at this earlier material is because, as you could see by some of the language, it's difficult for us to interpret to begin with. The language, it seems very much hyperbole, sort of repetitive. We have the 17th century, even earlier, views are very of beautiful statues and antiquities. They're very interactive. I hope I brought that out. You know, they really have the sense that these images are alive. They're very powerful, and it's exactly that power that we are trying, especially Islamic art historians, are trying to find a way for us to understand what is this power in the material. A lot of the reason why there's sort of interest in things, the power of things, is because maybe we're trying to regain the sense of the real power of materials as well. And that's something very strong in the Islamic tradition, which again can feed into the destruction that you're referring to, because if something's so powerful, it's dangerous. And that's also the reason why, you know, in exhibitions of icons, do you allow people to kiss them? Because a lot of images are viewed in many different ways and interacted with in many. Do you allow someone? Yeah. So I think I'm going into the earlier material because, with reference to Athens, because it became from the late 18th, 19th century so important for the European identity, and because the Ottomans tended to just start taking on board the European views, this earlier view of wonder really was downplayed. You don't hear it so much anymore. Instead, the Ottomans were buying into much more the idea that, oh yes, we're idolaters, or rather we're against idols. We don't care about them. So in that long answer, I'm just trying to pick out the variety, which is very important to the historian, and also the earlier period, which is very hard to interpret because it's full of what at first we might think of as cliches. You know, we're not used to that sort of language, the Ottoman language. And so it needs a very careful, steady conversation on many different levels. That doesn't mean that people won't also destroy images.
Thank you for your answer.
Thank you very much, first of all. That was fantastic. I think it was the Greenberg and Camilletis book that talks about how Elgin never would have been allowed to take the marbles off the mosque if it had stayed in its initial form rather than being the smaller prayer hall within the Acropolis. Do you think that there's a sense of attachment that develops between the space of the mosque and the figure representations that we see around it, to an extent that you'd actually have an opposition to removing these elements? I mean, I think in your second to last slide, you showed the section that the Christians had taken, yeah, that one.
Which one?
The one of the section the Christians took down.
Oh, yes.
Which I presume would have also been over the Qibla wall once the mosque was built. So that might eliminate the element of problems with having figure representations on the Qibla wall. But do you think that in general, around the mosque, there an attachment, a historic, powerful, however you want to phrase it, attachment grows between the space of the mosque and the power, as you said, of the classical elements around it?
That's a very complex, interesting question. I think it's really important to point out that when the building is intact, what you said, that when it is intact, it is cared for and looked after, and that it's a much harder, it's not possible to take away bits and pieces. You're maybe allowed to draw, and that's why we have some of these wonderful drawings from the artist of the Nointel. But that is really important to underline how these images were on both a Christian holy place and a Muslim holy place. I hadn't actually thought of that before, the Qibla. I mean, that's very interesting that it was the East End, but they were taken down off that end. So that saved them as well, that it might not have been kosher to have those images at the Qibla wall. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was just a convenience, wasn't it? It was convenient because those were taken down in the Christian building. Yeah. But those are the sort of questions that we need to ask about these buildings and how their function. And this is one of the difficult things about the state of any of these buildings that are today understood as only one of their phases. If we've lost the phase where they're Christian and they're Muslim, then we actually lose the power of the functioning building. I mean, obviously scholars long argue about what these things mean when they're temples as well, how vivid they were. So thank you, that's a very interesting reminder. And difficult.
There's one on the other side.
Thank you so much. I'm not too familiar with travel writing as a genre, so I think the question that arose for me was if we are to assume that I suppose the readers of this kind of text would be elite Ottoman or members of the elite Ottoman society, to what extent might that inform the way that it is described? Is there a stylistic element to this kind of writing which might inform the kinds of comparisons drawn or that kind of thing? I'm not sure if that's something that...
Yeah, no, and that because the two texts that I talked about tonight are they're quite different, and I hope I sort of drew that out. But it goes back really also to one of the early questions about damage and variety, and the fact that these very complicated text descriptions were very consciously written in a difficult way for a very learned audience, especially Mahmud Efendi. I mean, he's doing extremely sophisticated work, and it's not it's not really even travel writing, because that's Evliya Çelebi definitely is travel writing, but he too is quite sophisticated in his language. They're not writing for a wider audience, and so the variety comes in. That what we don't know, and this is what it's true with the Christian population too, we don't know what the guy in the street thinks about them. And we know, though, that's where some of the local legends we cling to, because we do the idea that it's a philosopher's tent. That sort of appellation, it seems that often it stays there. But I've taken much more seriously than some of my colleagues, I think. I refuse to call these cliches. I mean, I think that the idea that it was really important to give the Solomonic authority, both Evliya and Mahmud will say that Solomon was involved in the foundation of Athens, which you might think, okay, this is nonsense, and we think that actually, if you take seriously what they're saying this is part of our history, and it's not something alien we're going to destroy. It's a way of, to use a word that's become negative, but it's a way of appropriating, it's taking it, making it their own. And so that is why I think that things like the temple, the throne of Bilqis, which is quite common across the way in which Muslims will incorporate ancient buildings by calling it the throne of Solomon, of Jamshid, or those are ways that aren't just cliches or superficial. They're ways of really making these foreign, strange, mysterious buildings your own.
I'll take the one in the middle. And Anushka, do we have any online?
Hello, thank you. Thanks for your presentation. As part of your research, have you come across any comments from Ottoman sources about what happened following the bombardment in 1687.
What happened?
Following the bombardment in
Following it.
1687, what were they sorry for the loss? What was the general view on what happened to the mosque and to the Parthenon following the Venetian bombardment?
No, that's a really important question because we only recently have Evliya Çelebi doesn't comment on that. But there are places, the Mahmud Efendi, we don't know what his sources are, but I think it's local memory. And he does talk about all the numbers. He has a number of how many women and children and people were killed with the bombardment. And so, but he doesn't actually talk, and this is what I love for him to do. He doesn't talk about the buildings. He talks about the lives, the people's lives that were destroyed. And so that he would be our source. We don't, and we have another source I didn't talk about today, and he also doesn't, there's no sense of that. And unfortunately, we don't have documents. We don't have any documents like the tax registers. We don't have any other sort of documents that would talk about that loss, or maybe you would expect maybe something about the marble, because marbles are valuable and then how it's reused so far. But my experience with this subject is that things do emerge. So this is a question that interests me a lot. What was the reaction? But one important thing is that we know that they kept, probably for taxation, or for rather what you call employment reason, they kept the name the Citadel Mosque. That was, or they also called it sometimes the Mosque of Sultan Mehmed. They kept that name even during the period where we don't know that that the second little masjid had been built yet. So that may have purely been bureaucratic, but it was clearly also effective. It was affection. It was a sense that that's the prestige, is that that's the mosque of Sultan Mehmed. So you're not going to lose that, even if it's this very simple little, the second mosque is very simple. I don't know where it went there. I mean, there's so many pictures of it, but those are so far the little indications of the prestige, the affection people had towards it. It's a long way up, though, too. By then, there were other mosques you could go to in the town. Yeah.
We've had a fantastic lecture, and the questions and the response, I think, illustrate
nice.
that.
Thanks.
So can we thank Elizabeth again for a splendid presentation? I give notice the next meeting will be on Thursday, the 10th of October, when we will hear a paper, Landscape of Curiosities, the Prior's Hall Roman Villa Estate, by Paddy Lambert. The meeting stands adjourned. Please join us for a glass of wine outside.
Well, 6:15, there we are.
Perfect. Thank you. That was brilliant. That was great.
It's nice audience. Like people